There are moments when someone who's seen it all suddenly goes quiet, not out of fear, but because they've recognized a pattern they've seen before. Bill O'Reilly, after 5 decades of reporting from war zones, political battlegrounds, and the highest corridors of power, just made a prediction that sounds less like commentary and more like a warning. He believes we're watching the slow unraveling of moral order, the same sequence that turns once great societies into cautionary tales. His words aren't meant to scare you. They're meant to wake you up. Because, if he's right, the next few years will test whether America still remembers the difference between right and wrong. I want you to think about someone in your life who's been around long enough to see history repeat itself. Maybe a parent or grandparent who lived through wars, recessions, social upheavals. When that person speaks with a certain gravity, you listen differently, don't you? Bill O'Reilly is that voice for millions of Americans. He didn't just report the news for 50 years. He stood in the middle of it, asked the uncomfortable questions, and challenged people in power when it wasn't popular to do so. This isn't someone who built a career on fear-mongering or conspiracy theories. This is someone who's earned the right to be taken seriously. And here's what makes his latest message so striking. He's written over 20 #1 best-selling books, more than any other nonfiction author alive. His newest, Confronting Evil, hit the top of the charts the moment it released. But this book isn't another political hot take. It's something deeper, something that transcends party lines and election cycles. It's about the architecture of collapse, how civilizations crumble not because of external invasion, but because of internal rot. And it's what he says about that rot, about that evil, that stopped people cold. So, what does he mean by evil? Because that's a strong word, and it's easy to dismiss it as dramatic or old-fashioned. But O'Reilly isn't talking about monsters in horror movies or dictators in distant lands, at least not primarily. He's talking about something far more insidious, the quiet erosion that happens when good people decide it's easier to look away. He argues that evil doesn't need fanfare or grand manifestos, it just needs apathy. It needs you to believe that what's happening down the street, in the next town, in the cities you see on the news, won't eventually reach your door. Think of it like this. Imagine a neighborhood where everyone agrees to keep things clean and safe. Then one day, someone throws trash on the sidewalk. No one says anything. The next day, there's more trash. Still, no one speaks up. Within weeks, the street is cluttered, and people stop caring altogether. That's not a failure of infrastructure, that's a failure of will. O'Reilly says the same thing happens in societies. When accountability disappears, when standards dissolve, when people stop enforcing the difference between right and wrong, chaos doesn't announce itself with sirens. It just quietly moves in and makes itself at home. And his warning isn't philosophical, it's immediate. It's about what's happening right now in cities across America, in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just a generation ago. Take New York City, a place that was once synonymous with resilience, ambition, and order. O'Reilly paints a picture of a city where the police force is thousands of officers short of what it needs, where prosecutors refuse to prosecute, where violent crime is met with a shrug and a catch-and-release policy. He calls it a free fire zone on crime. That's not hyperbole. That's a man who's watched the systems that held society together get dismantled piece by piece. Here's what's happening, according to O'Reilly. The NYPD, which his own grandfather served in, is down roughly 10,000 officers from where it should be. And they're losing more every day. Experienced cops are retiring early, looking for work in states where they're not vilified for doing their jobs. Meanwhile, the city has implemented policies like no bail laws, which mean that people arrested for serious crimes are back on the streets within hours. Prosecutors, particularly in Manhattan, have adopted a philosophy that treats criminals as victims of circumstance rather than individuals responsible for their actions. So, if you punch someone, if you steal, if you vandalize, there's a growing chance nothing will happen to you. Now, you might be thinking, well, I don't live in New York. Why should this concern me? And that's exactly the mindset O'Reilly warns against. Because what starts in one city doesn't stay there. It's a signal flare. It's a test case. If a place as prominent and powerful as New York can descend into disorder, what makes you think your community is immune? The collapse of accountability in one place emboldens the forces of chaos everywhere else. It sends a message that the rules don't matter, that there are no consequences, that you can do what you want because no one's watching and no one cares. But the consequences aren't just about crime, they're economic. O'Reilly predicts a mass exodus from New York City, something in the range of 500,000 people leaving over the next 4 years. That's not a small number, that's entire neighborhoods emptying out, taking their tax dollars, their businesses, their energy with them. He says real estate in the areas just outside the city limits has already surged significantly since certain political figures announced their campaigns. Why? Because people see what's coming, they see the writing on the wall. They know that when a city elects leaders who promise to radically reshape the economy through heavy taxation, to defund or demoralize the police, to treat success as something to be punished rather than celebrated, the smart money moves. And it's not just individuals. Corporations are making the same calculation. They're looking at states like Tennessee, Florida, Texas, the Carolinas, places that still value stability, predictability, and rule of law. They're asking themselves, why would we stay in a city that's about to double our taxes, drive away our employees, and make it unsafe for our customers to visit our offices? It's not a political question. It's a survival question. And when the businesses leave, when the high earners leave, what's left behind? A hollowed-out shell of a city that can no longer afford to maintain its infrastructure, its schools, its hospitals, the very people the policies were supposed to help end up suffering the most. O'Reilly sees this as more than an economic trend. He sees it as moral flight. People aren't just escaping high taxes, they're escaping the collapse of a shared understanding of right and wrong. They're leaving because they don't want to raise their children in a place where effort isn't rewarded, where crime isn't punished, where truth is negotiable. And once that flight begins, it's almost impossible to reverse, because the people who leave are often the ones who had the resources and the know-how to fix things. Their departure accelerates the decline. But underneath those numbers, underneath the crime statistics and the moving trucks and the real estate listings, lies something deeper, a spiritual drift. O'Reilly argues that we've reached a point in American society where people no longer share a common understanding of what it means to be good. And that's not because we've become more diverse or more complex. It's because we've stopped teaching it. We've stopped insisting on it. We've stopped modeling it. He divides humanity into 3 groups. About 15%, he says, are just born bad. These are people who will hurt you and feel no remorse. They exist in every society, in every era. You can't fix them, you can only contain them. The other 85%, they have a choice. They can be good, or they can sit it out. And more people are sitting it out. Why? 2 reasons. Apathy and ignorance. Apathy is the belief that it won't happen to you. You see the news, you see the crime, you see the disorder, and you think, well, that's somewhere else. That's not my neighborhood. I can just build a wall, literal or metaphorical, and keep it out. But O'Reilly insists that's a fantasy. Evil doesn't respect boundaries. It doesn't stop at the edge of your driveway. It finds the cracks, and it seeps in. And by the time you realize it's your problem, it's too late to stop it. Ignorance, on the other hand, is more tragic. It's not about IQ, it's about a lack of knowledge. If you don't understand history, if you don't know how societies have failed in the past, if you've never been taught the principles that keep civilization functional, how can you recognize the warning signs? O'Reilly points to the public schools, which he says no longer teach history or civics in any meaningful way. They don't teach right and wrong. Instead, they teach ideologies that frame America as fundamentally broken, irredeemably flawed, a place that needs to be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. Now, I'm not here to tell you what to think about education policy, but I do want you to consider what happens when an entire generation grows up without understanding where they came from. If you don't know that freedom isn't the default setting of human civilization, that it's fragile and hard-won, that it requires constant maintenance, then you won't value it. You'll take it for granted. And when someone comes along promising to radically remake society, you won't have the context to ask, wait, hasn't this been tried before? And didn't it end badly? That brings us to one of the most chilling parts of O'Reilly's message. History is repeating itself, and we're not paying attention. He uses the example of Mao Zedong's China. Mao was responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of his own people, many of whom starved because of his policies. And yet, when O'Reilly visited Beijing recently, he saw Mao's portrait everywhere. The man is still celebrated as a hero. How is that possible? Because the Chinese people don't know their own history. They've been told a sanitized, propagandized version of events. They have no access to the truth, no way to learn what actually happened. And so the cycle continues. O'Reilly warns that the same thing is happening here, just in a different form. We're not banning books or censoring the internet in the same overt way, but we are creating an environment where inconvenient truths are dismissed, where history is rewritten to fit a narrative, where asking questions gets you labeled as a troublemaker. And when that happens on a large enough scale, when entire communities lose their grip on reality, manipulation becomes easy. You can convince people of anything if they have no baseline to measure it against. So where does that leave us? What's the end game if these trends continue? O'Reilly's forecast is dark. He sees rising crime, collapsing cities, mass migration, economic stagnation, and most troubling of all, a loss of trust. When people stop believing in institutions, when they stop believing in each other, when they stop believing that truth exists, society doesn't just decline, it disintegrates. And once that disintegration reaches a certain point, reversing it requires something close to a miracle. He quotes a principle that runs throughout history. Once evil gets established, it's almost impossible to stop. Not because evil is stronger than good, but because good requires effort. It requires people to stand up, speak out, take risks. Evil, on the other hand, just requires you to do nothing. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. We're living in a time when doing nothing feels safer than doing something, when staying quiet feels smarter than speaking up, when keeping your head down feels more rational than standing your ground. But O'Reilly insists this isn't inevitable. The future isn't written yet. It all depends on whether enough people still care, whether enough people are willing to say, no, this isn't acceptable, this isn't who we are, this isn't what we're going to become. The question is, are we? Think about the leaders in your community, in your state, in the cities you read about. How many of them have looked at a failing policy and said, I was wrong? How many have acknowledged that the path they've chosen has led to worse outcomes, not better ones? O'Reilly argues that we're living through an era of institutional denial, where the people in charge would rather double down on failure than admit they made a mistake. And that denial, he warns, is how civilizations rot from the top down. He points to city mayors and state governors who watch their streets fill with homeless encampments, their crime rates climb year after year, their tax bases shrink as people flee, and yet they continue insisting everything is fine. Or worse, they blame someone else. It's the previous administration's fault. It's systemic racism. It's climate change. It's anything except the policies they themselves enacted. This isn't about partisan politics. This is about basic accountability. When leaders refuse to connect cause and effect, when they live in what O'Reilly calls a world of denial, they create a vacuum where problems grow unchecked. Take Chicago as another example. Over the past decade, that city has seen thousands upon thousands of murders, the vast majority of them young African Americans in neighborhoods controlled by gangs. The former president reached out to the governor of Illinois not long ago with a straightforward proposal: let's work together. Call out the National Guard, bring in federal resources, flood the zone with law enforcement, and take back those neighborhoods. It wasn't a partisan offer, it was a practical one. And the response? A refusal. Not because the plan was flawed, but because accepting help would mean admitting the problem exists in the first place. O'Reilly sees this pattern everywhere. Leaders who have failed across the board, who have presided over chaos and suffering, now lashing out at anyone who offers a solution. Why? Because acknowledging the solution means acknowledging the failure. And for some people, protecting their pride is more important than protecting their citizens. That's not governance, that's ego. And when ego runs the show, the people pay the price. But it's not just the politicians. The media plays its role too. O'Reilly spent decades in television, becoming one of the most watched figures in cable news history. He knows how the system works, and he knows what's been lost. He mourns the death of real debate, the kind of robust, sometimes uncomfortable exchange of ideas that used to sharpen a nation's thinking. When he hosted his show, his instruction to his producers was simple: get me the smartest person who disagrees with me. Let's have it out. Let the audience see both sides and decide for themselves. That model, he says, is gone, replaced by echo chambers where hosts bring on guests who nod along, agree on every point, and reinforce the audience's existing beliefs. There's no tension, no challenge, no discovery, just comfort. And while comfort might feel good in the moment, it's poison for democracy. Because democracy depends on the collision of ideas. It depends on being willing to hear something you don't like, consider it seriously, and then make up your own mind. When media outlets decide to shelter their audiences from discomfort, they're not protecting them, they're infantilizing them. O'Reilly points out something that should concern everyone. He's the best-selling nonfiction author on the planet, and yet he can't get booked on certain prominent programs. Not because he's uninteresting or irrelevant. His books sell millions of copies. But because he represents a viewpoint those programs would rather ignore. That's not journalism. That's curation. That's deciding for the audience what they're allowed to hear. And when that becomes the norm, when exclusion becomes the standard, truth starts to suffocate. He even mentions someone like Jon Stewart, with whom he had legendary debates years ago. Those debates were entertaining, yes, but they were also meaningful. They forced both men to defend their ideas in real time. And viewers came away having actually learned something, having seen two intelligent people wrestle with a difficult issue. But that format has largely disappeared, replaced by one-sided monologues and carefully scripted conversations that never veer into uncomfortable territory. The nation, O'Reilly argues, is lesser for it. And here's the thing, this isn't just about television or newspapers. It's about a broader culture of intellectual cowardice. When universities disinvite speakers because students might be triggered, when social media platforms suppress posts that don't align with approved narratives, when people lose their jobs for expressing the wrong opinion, we're not building a more tolerant society. We're building a more fragile one. A society where people are afraid to think, afraid to speak, afraid to question, and when fear becomes the dominant emotion, freedom doesn't stand a chance. So what does all this mean for you, for me, for anyone trying to make sense of this moment? O'Reilly says the real divide in America isn't between left and right, liberal and conservative, red and blue. It's between courage and comfort. It's between people who are willing to confront hard truths and people who would rather bury their heads in the sand. And that divide cuts across every demographic, every region, every background. Courage, in this context, doesn't mean being fearless. It means acting despite the fear. It means speaking up when it's easier to stay silent. It means standing by your principles when the crowd is going the other direction. It means refusing to accept that this is just how things are now. Because comfort, while seductive, can be the quiet killer of freedom. When you prioritize comfort over truth, when you prioritize safety over justice, when you prioritize convenience over conviction, you're making a trade. And history shows that trade rarely works out in your favor. O'Reilly believes we're at a crossroads. One path leads to a slow, managed decline, where we accept disorder as the new normal, where we shrug at corruption, where we let the systems that made this country functional collapse out of apathy or fear. The other path requires something harder, a recommitment to the principles that actually work: personal responsibility, rule of law, accountability, the belief that actions have consequences, that truth matters, that some things are right and some things are wrong regardless of who's in power. This isn't a political program. You won't find it on a candidate's website. It's a cultural shift, a spiritual reckoning. It's about ordinary people deciding they're not going to let the loudest voices or the most extreme activists define reality for everyone else. It's about reclaiming the idea that you have a responsibility not just to yourself or your immediate family, but to the broader community, to the nation, to the future. And that responsibility starts with awareness. You can't confront evil if you don't recognize it. You can't defend truth if you don't know what it is. That's why O'Reilly wrote Confronting Evil in the first place. Not to sell books, though they sell plenty, but to sound an alarm. To say, Look, I've seen this movie before. I know how it ends. And we still have time to change the script, but only if we act now. He talks about visiting countries where freedom never took root, where people live under regimes that control every aspect of their lives. And he always comes back with the same observation. It's not that the people there are less intelligent or less deserving. It's that they never had the cultural infrastructure to sustain freedom. They never built the habits of self-governance, of civic participation, of holding their leaders accountable. And so when a would-be dictator came along promising order or prosperity or justice, they had no framework to push back. They didn't know what they were losing until it was already gone. America has that framework. We inherited it from generations who fought for it, who built it brick by brick, who passed it down with the understanding that it's fragile and needs constant care. But inheritance isn't the same as ownership. You have to claim it, you have to use it, you have to defend it. And right now, O'Reilly argues, too many people are letting it slip through their fingers without even realizing it. So, what does rebuilding moral clarity actually look like in practice? It starts small. It starts with your own choices. Do you speak the truth even when it costs you something? Do you stand up for someone being treated unfairly, even if they're not in your tribe? Do you hold yourself to a standard, even when no one's watching? These aren't grand, heroic acts. They're daily decisions, but they add up, and when enough people make those decisions, the culture shifts. It also means rejecting the idea that everything is relative, that there are no wrong answers, that everyone's truth is equally valid. Some things are true, and some things aren't. Some actions are right, and some are wrong. And pretending otherwise doesn't make you enlightened. It makes you complicit. It makes you part of the problem. O'Reilly isn't asking you to be judgmental or self-righteous. He's asking you to have a backbone, to believe in something, to stand for something. And it means teaching the next generation, whether it's your grandchildren, your neighbors' kids, or young people you mentor, they need to hear from you. They need to know what worked, what didn't, and why. They need to understand that freedom isn't free, that order isn't automatic, that the world doesn't owe them anything. They need to see adults who haven't given up, who haven't checked out, who still believe that individual effort and integrity matter. O'Reilly also stresses the importance of knowledge. Read, learn, understand history. Not the sanitized version, not the politically convenient version, but the real, complicated, messy version. Know how past civilizations rose and fell. Know what the founders of this country were thinking when they wrote the Constitution. Know why certain principles, like free speech and due process and property rights, were considered non-negotiable. Because when you have that knowledge, you're much harder to manipulate. You can smell the con from a mile away. Now you need to understand me here. None of this is easy. In fact, it's much easier to go along, to not make waves, to let someone else worry about it. But that's the choice O'Reilly is laying out. Easy now, catastrophic later, or hard now, sustainable later. And he's urging people, especially those with the wisdom of experience, to choose the latter, because you've seen enough to know that shortcuts rarely pay off. You've lived long enough to understand that character matters, that principles matter, that the choices we make today echo into tomorrow. He's not predicting doom because he wants to be proven right. He's predicting doom because he wants to be proven wrong. He wants someone to stand up and say, no, we're better than this. We're not going to let it happen. He wants to see a generation rise to the occasion, not with slogans or hashtags, but with action, with integrity, with courage. Bill O'Reilly's words weren't about fear. They were about responsibility. Every empire that collapsed told itself the same lie. It can't happen here. But it can. And it starts when we stop caring about what's true. It starts when we stop demanding accountability from our leaders and from ourselves. It starts when we trade courage for comfort and call it progress. The real fight ahead isn't between politicians or parties. It's not about who wins the next election or what laws get passed. It's between those who still see what's happening and those who refuse to look. It's between people who believe that truth and order and decency are worth defending and people who think those concepts are outdated relics of a less enlightened time. If you've made it this far, If you've listened to this entire message, then you're already part of the solution. You're paying attention, you're engaging with ideas, you're refusing to be passive. And that matters more than you might think. Because awareness is the first step, action is the second. And the action O'Reilly is calling for isn't radical or complicated. It's this: live like truth matters, speak like courage is contagious, and refuse to let apathy or ignorance win by default. If you believe awareness still matters, if you believe truth deserves a voice, help amplify it. Hit like, subscribe, and share this message, not because it's popular, but because it's necessary. Because the conversation we're having right now, the one about what kind of country we want to be, what kind of future we want to leave, can't happen if we're all sitting in silence. The world is watching to see if this generation has what it takes. Not to be perfect, not to have all the answers, but to care enough to try, to stand up when it's easier to sit down, to speak out when it's safer to stay quiet, to confront evil, not with violence or rage, but with a simple, stubborn insistence that some things are worth defending. That's the message, that's the warning, that's the choice. And what you do with it is up to you.